Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to have such an interesting panel to discuss the question of storytelling over the next 40 minutes or so. I'm often struck by the way in which the victors in various conflicts write the history, and the stories of the people who were defeated are lost, and that happens in all cultures, in all countries, and has presumably happened throughout history. But clearly, the stories we tell ourselves about the past largely shape our view of the present and are either an impediment or a benefit in building the future. So what we want to look at this afternoon, I think, what I want to hear your views about is what is the role of storytelling and the stories in your work in tourism. And Aziz, I'd like to start with you. You're from a company called Mejdi. You want to say a little bit about yourself and then explain how you use the narrative and storytelling in the work that you do with American travelers, primarily American travelers.
Yeah, I co-founded Mejdi Tours with a Jewish friend of mine. I'm Palestinian, and that in its own already a story and a narrative. And we did that because we've worked for years in conflict resolution together and each alone, and realized that if we can connect people in places that we work, like Afghanistan and Syria, we need to think of how to do it on a larger scale and to bring the complexities in the places we work at to those travelers. So we founded Mejdi, which in Arabic means honor, respect, to honor the travelers, the people who travel and the places where we go. And we decided to bring narratives and voices that people don't usually hear on tours. So that means instead of having one tour guide, we have two from different cultures. In Jerusalem, that means an Israeli and a Palestinian. In the United States, that sometimes can mean a conservative and a liberal. In Northern Ireland, that can mean a Catholic and a Protestant. Some places are more complex than even two narratives. In the Balkans, you have so many different groups, and we meet through the trips with Serbs, with Croats, and with Bosniaks, and just you realize how much people miss it through their travels because they don't usually get to hear those stories, the stories of complexity, that there's no just one narrative that weaves all together and it's all a beautiful story and nothing is wrong where we go. No, we wanted people to hear the beautiful stories, but also hear the challenges, hear the problems that people go through, hear the different opinions, and meet beyond just the tour guides. Meet the normal people in the streets, have dinners in people's homes, meet artists, meet politicians, meet journalists, and get to really understand, love, struggle with the destinations we travel to. And I think that's what makes travel fun for me and makes it worthwhile to do.
Aziz, before we move on, one of the things that always strikes me about Islam, and it's the same with Christianity, is that people tend to talk about Christianity and Islam as though they're unified codes. And in fact, both religions, both major religions, are massively divided, as is the Jewish religion. I mean, there are many factions and schisms and sects within both. Are you able to address that in any way through the work that Mejdi does?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when we go to a place like Oman, for example, I really enjoy introducing people to the Abada group, which most people have never heard about this group. And they are extremely pro-peace group who don't feel they should be involved in any conflicts. We talk a lot about Shias and Sunnis. I tell my story. I grew up in a Sunni family where I didn't know what Shias are. And I remember when I was a little kid watching a movie about a war between Shias and Sunnis, Iraq and Iran then, and how I thought the Iraqis, the Sunnis were the good Muslims and the Shias were the infidels, the Iranians. And my sister walks in, who was religious English teacher, and she explained to me how wrong I was, and explained to me that most Muslims don't even speak Arabic, and many Muslims are not Sunnis. And even to Muslim communities, that's sometimes something we learn about. My family had to learn about. I had to learn about. So we try definitely to do that in our tours, and I think almost in every tour, these conversations about the diversity within the Muslim groups, the Sufis, when you go to a place like Bosnia, Sufism is quite strong there. You go to Morocco, Sufism is very powerful in these places, and in other countries it's not. So we talk about why and where and what are these different groups, and have how one group doesn't represent all Muslims, how Arabs don't represent even the majority, or not even a huge significant part of Islam. Arabs are like less than a quarter, more or less, of all Muslims in the world.
You mentioned Sufis as well, just to labour the point a bit, Aziz. I mean, clearly there are quite major divisions within Sufism as well.
Oh yeah, there are very different groups within Sufism, a lot of divisions even within that group. And because it's a very charismatic religion, each stream kind of takes it to a different place. Some can be quite extreme even in their manifestation. I would say though, I went to the first time to a Sufi, real Sufi, not just not, there are places where they do these shows and they have the dervishes kind of dance in front of people, but it's more for tourists. But first time I went to a real Sufi service of zikr was in Bosnia. And I was able to take a group of travelers with me who the imam there let us join at the mosque very graciously. And it was so powerful, even for people who didn't speak Arabic. It was so moving. And even for me, who I grew up in a religious family, I've never witnessed anything like that. And it was just incredible to see that.
Thanks, Aziz. Zara, you touch on storytelling, it seems to me, in at least two quite significantly different ways. Zara Sekhavati is a guidebook editor, but you've also been doing some teaching using stories. I wondered if you might, Zara, for our benefit, just reflect on your experience of storytelling from those two different perspectives.
Yeah, so with the guidebook, it is a lot of factual information, but in our guidebooks particularly, you do get boxes of culture, and you do learn a lot about the history and the different cultures within the destination that you're going to. And also with teaching, I've taught many ages from 3 to about 60, so the storytelling changes throughout those different generations and how you tell a story. So I've been reading some stories for People and Places, just going through the pictures and the specific words. But as you get older, the context and the language changes a lot. And also with the guidebooks, I think with travel, there's so much storytelling to be told. It just needs to be done in the right way and with a balance. And there have been bad things, but there have also been good things, and it just needs to be a balanced story. And there's so many ways to tell the story, especially now, well, with the guidebooks, but also there's podcasts and there's visual ways to see the story with photographs and interviews, but it's just all about having a balance, I think. And just, it makes traveling and learning just more fun if you have a story there. And they're also, I think, depending on the story, you could relate to them, you could learn a lot, and it just opens up your mind, I think.
Why do you think it opens up the mind by understanding the story?
Because I think with travel, particularly, a lot of people can travel but not really know much about where they're going to. But with a story, I think even without a language barrier, even if there is a language barrier, there's always a story to be told. I remember when I was in Petra, I did Petra by Night, and it's a musical storytelling of the people of Jordan, but I don't speak any Arabic really, only a few words, but they were just singing, there was lots of poetry and there was music, and I just think there's so many different ways a story can be told, and it opens up the mind, because you might just learn something that you never knew. I'd never heard of the instrument that the musician had played with at that point. And yeah, storytelling is just a great way to just present something new, I think, and to really think about where you're going and why you're going.
It's a way into something different as well, isn't it? I don't know quite why, but the word grockling has entered my mind, which is a slang term used in, can't now remember whether it's Devon or Cornwall. They have two different words, but grockling is either Devon or Cornwall, and it's the word they use to describe a tourist. Because a tourist comes and grockles, they come and kind of, they look, they're voyeuristic, they don't really engage, they kind of stand slightly outside of things and look. And there's obviously two problems with that. One, they often don't understand what it is that they're seeing. And secondly, I always think they're being rather cheated of what they ought to be getting from the experience through some kind of engagement with the local cultures in the place that they're visiting. But that's the heart of the problem, isn't it? That nearly everywhere, I would argue everywhere, has multiple stories. There aren't places with one story. I mean, if you take if we were to take Jerusalem, Aziz, clearly there are lots of different stories about all the major buildings in Jerusalem from different periods and from different religions and from different parts of different religions. So it's a really complex thing to understand. And it seems to me the same is true of almost everywhere in the world, that there are competing stories and completely competing ways of understanding what's going on. And how do you deal with that, Zara, in terms of the guidebooks?
Yeah, the people who work on the guidebooks are just heavily updating it, heavily researching, and they're always going out there and they're always working with locals. But also on a personal level, my dad's family is from Iran, so I think storytelling there is, with the media of today, it's very much, quite negative, I'd say, in the headlines and the news, and you just hear a kind of one side of Iran, and a lot of the everyday people aren't really shown on the news, but there have been amazing documentaries and food programs, and recently The Art of Persia on the BBC was released, which shows a different side and completely different stories of culture that a lot of people don't know about Iran and Persia. And I think, yeah, storytelling is the way to educate people. And yeah, we need to have a more balanced kind of view and to not always just be one-sided with the news and to think, oh, this country is like this because the BBC News says it. There's so much to a country and its people. And yes, stereotyping obviously is a very negative aspect of that, but education is just the way forward, I think, and responsible travel is as well.
Zara, I'm not sure whether you'll agree with what I'm about to say, but please do feel free to disagree. As far as I know, Mejdi is the only company which deliberately sets up this dual or multiple narrative way of understanding a country. I don't know of any other tour operator that does that. Have you come across it anywhere else?
No, I haven't. I loved reading about the tours and everything that you do because I thought it's so refreshing, because I think there's such a danger in travel to just, have a kind of package tour. You're told that something by someone just once by a specific person, you're not kind of mixing with anyone else. And yeah, I've never heard of a tour completely.
When I was tour leading, Zara, I mean, you always remember the bad ones, don't you? But I remember I used to tour lead in Moscow, and when it was called Leningrad. And what was extraordinary is the guys would know the weight and the height of all the things in the Kremlin, but they couldn't tell you anything else. So it was a really boring tour. You would just go around taking photographs of these things, and they tell you when it was cast, where it was cast, how heavy it was, and how tall it was. Probably the least important things. They must have been, I don't know, they must have been touring with somebody very odd. They're obviously trained to do it in a very peculiar way. But you learn nothing about the history of the Tsars and the development of the Kremlin, nor of the connections with the Ukraine. We do hear something about that when you went to the Ukraine. Very odd. Anyway, I'm sure that most guides are better than that now, although I do wonder sometimes. Can we come back though to the role of storytelling in the educational sense? Because I think both Aziz and Zara, both of you have been English as a second language teachers, and you've both obviously done quite a lot of storytelling. How do you see the role of storytelling in relation to educating particularly younger people about other cultures? How do you, does it have a role in that? And can we use virtual reality in a way, if you like? Can we use the web to enable people to learn about cultures of places they'll never visit?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, especially now with global warming, everything going on with the environment. I think that virtual tours are the way forward, really. And especially with the pandemic, there are all those amazing museum tours out there. And especially for kids, I think that's a great way to learn. You know, most of them are kind of connected to a screen most of the time anyway, so you might as well give them an educational tour. And when I was teaching abroad, I'd always, the first few lessons, really kind of tell the students about where I'd come from, my background. I'd take pictures, I'd take little gifts, and especially at the end of the semester. So, and also even specific things like accents. I think the students didn't know, some of the students that I taught didn't know that there were different accents in England, even though it was such a small place. And even with the phonetics, I'm from the north, so I'd say grass, but then I had to teach the Queen's English and say grass. So I'd have to show that difference. And just storytelling just comes in such different forms, I think, and it's really important. And I think particularly with children, they are
May
used
I
to
say
stories.
something?
Sally, I was hoping we were going to move on to this issue of how you use storytelling in education as well.
But may I just say something quite important about something that we've just experienced very recently? We're, of course, trying to find a way that our volunteers can help the organizations we work with that are supporting and educating children all over the world. And one of our volunteers did the simplest thing. They just walked around their own, they had a small holding, and they just walked around their own small holding and talked about winter in the UK, and talked about the seasons, and talked about deciduous trees versus evergreen trees, and how bees pollinate. And the leaders of the education programs we work with came back and said, this is probably the most useful story you've sent us. This is about your life in the UK. This really connects us. Please send us more of this.
It's interesting because when I was tour leading in places like Russia and China and Vietnam, we used to get the guests, the travelers, to bring postcards from home to leave behind, and as a way of having something to talk to local people about. And in 30 years since then, it's been completely transformed, hasn't it, by the use of the internet and the opportunities which exist with mobile cameras and so on to do something much more sophisticated. But much of the travel industry isn't doing it. They've still got people going off on...
They're telling a story, but it's their story. They're telling a story, but it's their story. It's an old-fashioned story. And it's the story they think their travelers want to hear.
Yes, that's true. But it's also often, I mean, many countries still have official guides who have an official story, which the official guides are required to communicate to the tourists. I mean, that's still a predominant model, unfortunately, around the world.
Right.
You know, there are qualified guides. You must come across this all the time, Aziz. Qualified guides who will go off message, as it were.
It's a challenge for us, and we found that you have to almost retrain many guides, because many countries, the official training is exactly what you mentioned earlier. You are taught how to tell the history from how heavy and how old and how this and how that, and then you are told also few stories, but a few stories that fit into a very singular narrative, that it's a marketing from the country. This is what we want people who travel to our country to know. And when we push an alternative narrative, the guides don't know these stories. And so you have to work for them from the beginning. And I've met guides, not every guide is willing to do it. I've met guides who didn't want us to bring other voices, who I would say, hey, we're gonna have you meet in Cairo, we're gonna have you meet with people in Garbage City and learn about recycling and how the Christian community there has become one of the most impressive recycling projects probably in the world. And the guide tried to give me a million reasons how it's not smart and it's dirty and these people. I'm like, dude, I've been there. I know what I'm talking about. Don't try. And I know the people who will meet us there. But guides are not used to that. And so you have to push to change how the training, I think, among tour guides are happening. And for us as a company, the only way we do it is train our own tour guides, have it build it as a community. We work with those same guides again. They bring more tour guides to work with us. And we're doing it now with the virtual aspect. We're training our tour guides on how to use 360 cameras, how to tell stories on camera. It's a whole new talent that they didn't have before. And fortunately, technology is developing in a way that makes it possible for us to do that. And I think because of the pandemic, as horrible as it is, it has accelerated that. And schools, universities, even communities have realized, oh, wait, we can do stuff for everyone who can't sometimes travel in person. Not every student is going to be able to go to Jerusalem or go to the United States or go to the UK. So why can't we at least give them a taste of the narratives, the stories that are there, have them meet with somebody from there? And I'll tell you one example. I don't know if I'm allowed or able to share a screen. I'll show you one project I worked with between kind of travel and storytelling. And this is a project I did with somebody, a teacher from Spain, who wanted to get her students to learn about stories from Palestine. And she told them my story, but she didn't tell them my whole story. She only told them my story until I was 10 years old. At that point, my brother had been killed. I was all about revenge. I haven't yet got into peace and conflict resolution. And she told the students to fill in their imagination. What would a kid who's 10 years old would do if his brother was killed? And suddenly these kids had so much imagination to work with. And this is one of them. This kid imagined that from revenge, I become into a peace activist. But then this kid imagined that I go into revenge and that I would go and kill somebody and eventually get killed, which I don't like the ending of this one. But it was very powerful because this is possible to do virtually. They didn't come to Jerusalem to learn about this. And suddenly these kids are telling a story from their own imagination. You can have a discussion with them about it. This can happen in classrooms. And yet too often we don't allow, we talk just like on tours you're mentioning, even classrooms, we talk a lot about weights and length and wide and how this and how that, but we don't tell stories and we don't allow people to engage with those stories that would be life-changing.
What's interesting about that is the dynamic element, isn't it? Because there are multiple possible outcomes from that story. And then presumably the teacher shared, or you shared your own story about what actually happened.
Yes. And then it created a whole discussion about revenge. Is it good or bad? Bullying, is it good or bad? How do you deal with your anger? How do you deal with that feeling of revenge in your own self? And suddenly it's easier to talk about these important topics because they were able to engage with a story and relate to it. Where in normal circumstances, you go to a class of 15-year-olds and you say, let's talk about revenge. It's not going to be easy to do that. Stories is how we communicate as a human beings, and yet somehow it's often forgotten in our educational system, in our travel setups. It's kind of set aside as, oh, well, stories, you know.
Zara, what's been your experience of of the work you've been doing with people and places in terms of storytelling. You've been working with Cambodia, I think. Has that been an easy process, or have you found it very difficult?
I found it really interesting because I've never been to Southeast Asia. So when I was making the podcast for People and Places, I spoke to Zara about Cambodia, stories from there, bits about the culture, the history, and the food. So I've taught myself basically a lot of podcasting software over the pandemic because I only host and write the scripts for the one at work. So I've never actually done the production side. So yeah, it's been interesting. It's definitely been great to learn about the podcasting software. And yeah, no, I can't wait to go. All the stories that Dara was telling me about, it's got me really excited about it. And
Sallie, from People and Places point of view, how successful has it been?
Sorry, how do we what?
How successful has the storytelling process been from People and Places point of view?
Well, storytelling's been important to People and Places right from the very beginning. We have always strongly felt that local people need to tell their own story, and volunteers need to, the people who want to travel to engage have a story which is as equally as important. So the whole premise, People and Places is a Skillshare program. The idea is that volunteers share their skills to enable local communities to build the futures they want for themselves, not the futures we think they should have, but to share the skills with us, them that enables them to do that. In order to do that, there has to be quite an open dialogue, and each side must then share their story. But all too often, the story has been imbalanced. It's either been, oh, we must think only of the economically poor community we're going to serve, or we think only of the consumer, the volunteer traveler, and that isn't balanced, that isn't respectful. It needs to be a story of equals. Each story is as important, and the stories are complex. So our role is to encourage the volunteers to share their stories and to encourage the local communities to share their stories. But in order to do that in a meaningful way, they have to feel safe and of value. And I'm sorry, but generally the volunteer travel industry has not done that. So storytelling's always been important to us.
One of the things that worries me more and more is that it's very clear that the way in which people understand the world is a function of the stories they've believed about how the world has got to be the way it is. And that determines to a large extent their views of what the solution might be. And it seems to me, Aziz, that you and I live in countries where a particular narrative has become very dominant about why our country is the way it is. In our case, everything is the fault of the European Union. In your case, I can't even work it out from outside the country, but there's some extraordinary legends and myths which have got around, which seem to me completely to lack any foundation in truth at all. And it worries me slightly. I mean, as much as I think storytelling is fundamental to a good tourism experience and it's fundamental to understanding, the problem is that the bad stories get around as well, and some of them are really difficult to dislodge. And the growth of conspiracy theory, which started in America and has now come to dominate so much of the world, It didn't start in America, it was around before, but it's been very dominant in America.
But there's also another big problem. It isn't just a problem with us, Harold. For example, we work in Cambodia, and there is a huge danger that everything is coloured by what the Khmer did. That's not true. There's also, I mean, yes, it's hugely important, but there's also a culture of hundreds of years before that of children not disagreeing with their elders, or even adults not disagreeing with their elders, so that people are promoted into positions of leadership with no skills, but simply because they're older. And in so many of the countries where we work, it isn't simply the complex. It's like South Africa. People think, and not only the visitor, but the people themselves, their story is, we are victims of apartheid. So we are victims. And we have to work through those stories. The stories are much deeper than that.
I agree. I spent some time in Cambodia to build tours there, which we were hoping to start in 2020 and been delayed now. And one of the things I wanted to do there is to show the story of survivors as well, not only the story of the victim, to show innovation that's happening in the country, to show things that, you know, I went to Killing Fields, and I think it's really important that travelers do go there and learn about how spreading false stories can destroy a country, because that's what happened in Cambodia. But also, we built significant part of our tour, not just on Siem Reap and the Killing Fields, but also on meeting people who are innovating, who are creating youth groups and music and theater and like unbelievable stuff that gives you so much hope. And sometimes that's missing. And I think that's true in the United States as well now. We have a lot of bad stories, a lot of mistrust, a lot of lies about each other going on. And to me, travel has a role in breaking that. Americans like to travel locally, but they don't travel often with storytelling, meaning they'll go see the nature, you know, visit a couple of museums, and that's it. And what I've been working on, especially now through the pandemic, is work around that. If you going to an area like Arizona or New Mexico or Utah, there's a huge Native American community there that most travelers will go see all these amazing sites. It's one of the most beautiful places in the United States, those incredible mountains and formations, rock formations, but not realize these are holy spots for the Navajo Nation, for example. And there are tens of thousands of those people living still there. They can take you and show you, and you can meet with them in a respectful way, and they're interested. But very rarely does that happen. So what I want to do, or what I think other companies should be doing and other groups should be doing, is to bring those stories in. You know, when Americans travel to a place like Peru, I've been there, run trips there, they dying to meet with indigenous communities. They think it's the coolest thing. Let's meet with somebody who's indigenous. But then we got a lot of indigenous communities here in our own country. And
health and safety and insurance.
Right, because we will be challenged through the story in our own country. It will push us out of our comfort zone. It's easier for me to meet an indigenous person in Peru who's poor or struggling or whatever, and I'll feel bad for them. But if I meet somebody in my own community and realize there's an injustice there, that means I need to act upon it. And kind of the travel, sometimes industry disconnects itself from that, saying, well, we don't want to make people too uncomfortable, and I get that. But we have to step out a little bit out of our comfort zone and explore the different stories in our own community. When I ran our first trip of dual narrative in Washington, D.C., all our travelers were from the city. I had a Republican and a Democrat co-lead the trip together. And we went to a neighborhood called Anacostia, one of the oldest neighborhoods in DC, has some incredible sites, incredible museums, like a Frederick Douglass Museum. None of the people on the tour who all lived in Washington have ever been in that neighborhood because it's mostly Black neighborhood. And they were, you know, normally uncomfortable going there. And when we spent time there and heard the stories and met with community people, visited the museum, it was very powerful. And we had a very heavy discussion. It wasn't easy, not everybody agreed. But that's how you cross boundaries. That's how change, I think, happens, is you challenge yourself. You're willing to hear stories you didn't know. And when you hear it face to face, I think it's much more powerful than when you hear it from the media. That's how you kill those bad stories we're talking about.
Aziz, may I ask you a question? How do you balance, do you think about how much you educate and how much you provide an enjoyable experience? Because for so many people, their holiday, they've had to save for, they've only got precious days. How much should we expect of the traveler, the tourist, to want to be educated through their trips?
Yeah, we definitely had to struggle through figuring out the balance. It's not easy, but I think we've come around eventually. One is, yes, you do need to give people time to explore and have fun and all of that. But two, not all educational meetings are really not fun, let's say. I mean, going and eating in somebody's home is a memorable experience that to me always is the thing that stands out. I mentioned Peru earlier, going to a village and meeting some kids who took me to their home and met with the family and just spent like half a day just talking to them, drinking tea. I don't speak good Spanish. They didn't speak any English. And yet it's one of the most enjoyable things I had. And travelers who come with us realize that. I think we kind of sold, in travel, we've been sold this slide that fun means sightseeing, fun means being on the beach, fun being, you know, all these things. And yes, these are fun. I enjoy them too. But fun is also learning about the craft. Fun is also learning about the history. Fun is also drinking tea with someone in their home from that culture. I was telling Harold before we started, when I went to Russia, I spent time in Moscow, did all these cool things people do in Moscow. It was cool. Then I went to Kazan and Samara, and there I watched the football game, met with a fan, invited me to his home in a village out in the middle of nowhere, went there with a couple of friends. It was the best night I had in Russia because I spent time with this guy, his mother, his grandpa, his neighbors. We drank, we ate, we barbecued. There was no electricity, there was no water. Sometimes we cut wood ourselves. To me, that was so enjoyable. And I think we need to rethink what we sell to people as fun. And this list of top 10 sites you must see in every destination is not the most interesting thing in those destinations. And I hate those kind of articles because they're selling us lies. That's the same as the media, Harold, you talking about, of like there's a lot of wrong stories. The wrong stories don't go just into, well, here's who you should hate and here's who you should love. But the wrong stories that we are sold often is that there's only few sites in each country. You only visit those sites, and that's the most fun you can have. And that's not true.
And that's not the worst of it in a way, is it? Zara, one of the things that always strikes me about the kind of guidebooks that you are involved with is that they do offer an understanding of the facts of the history, and the cultural component in guidebooks is growing. It's certainly got better over the last 20 years. But most people engage first through the couple pages of the newspapers. And they seem to me to be increasingly dominated by the 10 best spas in the world and the 10 most romantic getaways and the 50 best safari camps. It's still very primitive, isn't it, in terms of the way travel writing in the newspapers covers the experience of travel. It's all about, as it were, the consumption of the material, and very rarely about the quality of the experience. And it seems to me, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Zara, that the things when we think back on our trips, the things we remember are those personal encounters, of the way in which Aziz has just been talking about it. Is that your understanding as well? You share that?
Yes, I definitely agree that with travel, there's a lot of the top 10 places and you have to go to them. And if you haven't been to all 10, you've not succeeded on your holiday. And I think that just really takes the fun out of it, because you're kind of disappointed if you haven't visited one of those top 10 places, but you're not really that. I think it takes away an element of being present, because you're just dashing away and, oh, I've seen this museum and now I've got to go to that site. And I think you can go on holiday and not have a conversation with someone from that place at all, because you're just with your friend, or you're reading things all in English and you're not having any conversations with any local people. Yeah, I do think that is a danger with travel, and specifically, well, with storytelling, with the newspapers as well and the magazines out there. I think for me personally, I would always choose a narrative storytelling piece over a top 5 spa breaks in the UK or something, because you get the quotes from the locals, you feel like you're there with them, the sights, you get the senses, you get a real feeling of where they are in that place, and you've met this amazing person and you feel their connection. So yeah, I think listicles can be great for kind of a basic research of, okay, in London there's this to do, there's that to do, but it shouldn't for me be the sole focus of your trip. It's great to see those places, but remember that you are there to meet the people, and they are the ones with the stories, and they are the people that you will remember. Like you said, it's the food that you had with that with the local person that you met at the market. It's that cup of tea that you had randomly at this market with someone who sells the most amazing spices or something. It's those people that you remember the most, for me anyway.
What does seem to be coming through as an issue more frequently now is people's irritation when they go somewhere they only meet other tourists.
Yes.
It's even worse than when they used to only meet the hotel staff. I remember going to stay in Wales. It was what was supposed to be, I'd say I didn't book this myself, but it's supposed to be staying in a Welsh country hotel right on the edge of the village. It was staffed entirely by very hospitable Polish people, but they knew nothing about the village. So in a sense, you immediately feel robbed of that local cultural experience. I mean, the food was fine, but it was international. It wasn't in any way Welsh, and there's no connection with the local culture. At which point it seems to me that the traveller is being robbed of what is, for many travellers, a very important part of the experience.
And also on a personal level, to talk about Iran again, in the guidebooks that Iran features, the first thing, the sightseeing experiences that, they're all there, but the top experience is always to meet the people, because somewhere like Iran, kind of have a bad reputation in a lot of people's minds. Whenever I say I go, even though I have family there, people ask me, oh, is it safe to go? And that's kind of the very first question I always get asked. But it's so nice to see that meeting the people is being recognised as the best thing to do there, because there are amazing museums and gardens, and there's the desert, and the food is incredible, but it is the people who have that power to educate. And all the travel logs, all the blogs that I've read about people coming back from somewhere like Iran, it's always, they're the friendliest people I've ever met. They're not like how it is in the media. So yeah, the people are definitely number one, I think, for for travel, for education and storytelling.
I think that's a great place to end this conversation this afternoon. Thank you all very much for your time. I'm sure we're going to return to this theme. I think that getting back control of the narrative for many countries, and getting back to a control of narratives, It's going to be a very important part of the future. Thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon.